In front of his entire squadron, my brother Jax shoved a crumpled $50 bill into my hand. "For gas money, Trina," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know that IT salary doesn't stretch far." My hand clenched around the paper, the rough edges digging into my palm as I stood there in silence. But he didn't know. My signature on a classified document just last night was the only reason his plane was even safe to fly today. My name is Trina York, and at 39 years old, I've learned that some worlds are not meant to overlap. Tonight, I was standing in one I didn't belong to. The officers' club at Andrews Air Force Base always smelled the same. A heady mix of old leather from the wingback chairs, expensive bourbon, and the confident, booming laughter of men who believed they owned the sky. It was a world of polished oak, brass fixtures, and dark blue A-class uniforms adorned with silver wings. It was my brother's world, and I was just a visitor, an anomaly in a simple navy blue dress that felt a universe away from the decorated uniforms surrounding me. I stood near a tall window, watching the runway lights blink in the twilight, a silent observer on the edge of their universe. A voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Trina, over here." It was my brother, Major Jax York, the center of gravity in any room he entered. He was holding court near the bar, his F-22 pilot swagger on full display. He beckoned me with a grand gesture, and a path cleared for me as if by royal decree. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, curious and dismissive. I walked toward him, my sensible heels sinking into the thick carpet, each step a reluctant concession. He threw an arm around my shoulders. It wasn't an embrace, it was an act of possession, a casual claim. "Guys, this is my big sister, Trina," he announced to his squadron. He then leaned in, his voice a stage whisper meant for everyone to hear. "She's the brains in the family, does all that computer stuff." A few of his friends chuckled, a low, knowing sound. Then it happened. Jax reached into the pocket of his perfectly pressed trousers and pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. He pressed it into my palm, his fingers closing mine around it. "For gas money, Trina," he said, his smile a little too wide, a little too condescending. "I know that IT salary doesn't stretch far in Northern Virginia." My hand clenched around the bill. The paper was rough, worn, its creases digging into my skin like tiny razors. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a tide of humiliation. I looked past Jax, at the faces of his friends. They weren't laughing out loud. It was worse. It was a collection of quiet smirks, of pitying glances exchanged over the rims of their glasses. They saw me exactly as he wanted them to. The poor, struggling older sister, the bookish spinster living off the scraps of a menial government job, a charity case at her own brother's celebration. My throat was tight, a knot of unspoken words. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the money back in his face. I wanted to tell them all what I really did. But my oath, the one I took with my hand on a Bible, wasn't just to the Constitution. It was an oath of silence, a silence that, in this moment, felt like a cage. So I just nodded, a single, small movement. It was all I could manage. My silence was my shield, but it was also their confirmation. To them, it was acquiescence, an admission of my lesser place in the York family hierarchy. My father, Colonel Richard York, retired, stood a few feet away, nursing a glass of scotch. He caught my eye, and for a fleeting second, I saw not support, but a flicker of something that looked like embarrassment. He gave a slight, almost perceptible shake of his head, as if to say, "Just take it, Trina. Don't make a scene." He then turned back to his conversation, dismissing me, my humiliation, and my existence in one swift motion. The message was clear. I was an afterthought. Just then, I felt a faint, insistent vibration in my clutch. My secure pager. I slipped my hand inside, my fingers finding the small device. The screen glowed with a single encrypted line of text. Black Hawk secure. Asset recovered. Good work, General. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A memory, sharp and vivid, sliced through the noise and the shame. It wasn't a distant memory. It was from 12 hours ago. I was in a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility. A sterile, windowless box, buried deep underground. The only light coming from the cool blue glow of a dozen monitors. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee. I was standing over a tactical map, my team watching me, waiting for the final call. The life of a captured CIA asset was on the line, and with him, the intelligence he carried, details of a planned surface-to-air missile attack, on this very base. On Andrews, it was my call, my decision alone. A gut-wrenching, high-stakes gamble based on fragmented data and a deep understanding of our enemy's cyber doctrine. I gave the order, a single word that unleashed a silent digital storm halfway across the world, neutralizing the threat and creating the window for the extraction team. Good work, General. The words on the small screen were a stark, brutal contrast to the scene in front of me. The men in this room, laughing and drinking, owed their lives to the computer stuff I did. My brother Jax, the celebrated hero, was alive to receive his award tonight, because his charity case sister, a brigadier general he didn't even know existed, had spent the night staring into the abyss to keep him safe. I looked down at the crumpled $50 bill in my hand. It suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a profane token for the lives I had protected. It was the price of their ignorance, the cost of my silence. And as I stood there, invisible in plain sight, I felt something shift inside me. The humiliation was still there, but beneath it, a new layer was forming, hard, cold, resolute. This paper, this insult, it wasn't the first. It was just the newest scar on a very old map. The $50 bill in my clutch felt less like paper and more like a stone. My final words from the last chapter, spoken only in my mind, echoed as I walked away from the bar. This insult. It wasn't the first. It was just the newest scar on a very old map. I made my way toward the main auditorium, my path taking me down a long, quiet corridor lined with portraits. The Wall of Honor. Black and white photographs of stern-faced generals, their eyes seeming to follow me, their chests heavy with medals earned in wars I'd only read about in history books. Each face was a testament to a certain kind of valor, a loud, visible courage. My kind of courage was silent, buried under layers of classification. I paused in front of a portrait of a World War II general, his gaze distant. The polished glass reflected my own face, and for a moment, I wasn't a 39-year-old woman, but a 15-year-old girl, standing in the warm, pine-scented living room of our house in Alexandria on Christmas morning. That was the first deep cut on the map. The air was filled with the scent of Mom's gingerbread cookies and the crackle of the fireplace. Jax, who was 12 then, let out a whoop of joy as he tore the wrapping paper off a massive box. Inside was a meticulously detailed, die-cast model of an F-15 Eagle, the same jet my father flew. It was an expensive, almost professional-grade collector's item. Dad knelt beside him, his face beaming with a pride I had rarely seen directed at me. "That's a real warrior's plane, son," he'd said, ruffling Jax's hair. My gift came next. I had just won the Virginia State Science Fair for a program I'd written, a rudimentary encryption algorithm. My present was a paperback romance novel, its cover featuring a Fabio-esque man with flowing hair. My mother, Eleanor, smiled and patted my head. "Live a little, Trina," she'd urged gently. "Don't just stare at a screen all day." I'd looked at my father, hoping for a word of praise for my achievement. Instead, his eyes held a familiar, resigned disappointment. He wanted 2 sons, 2 pilots, he had 1, and a daughter he considered a strange, intellectual puzzle he had no interest in solving. That was the day I understood. My world of logic and code would never be as valuable as Jax's world of speed and glory. The scar was small, but it set the course for all the others. A pair of officers walked past me, their conversation pulling me from the memory. I continued down the hall, the weight in my clutch seeming to grow heavier. The most recent scar wasn't from 20 years ago. It was from 1 month ago. It was a Sunday evening, a tradition in the York household. My mother had made her famous roasted chicken, but it was dry and tasteless, a perfect match for the tense atmosphere around the dining table. The topic of conversation was the house, the historic slate roof of our family home in Old Town Alexandria, needed a complete overhaul, a project that would cost over $100,000. Jax, ever the man of action, had laid out a series of complicated, high-risk investment schemes he was pursuing. He spoke of stocks and ventures with a confidence that far outstripped his actual knowledge. Then all eyes turned to me. It was my father who asked, his voice flat, devoid of real expectation. "And you, Trina, what's your contribution?" The question wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a test, a challenge I was expected to fail. I took a calm sip of water, placed the glass down, and looked him in the eye. "I can wire the full amount tomorrow morning," I said, my voice even. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the table. Jax let out a short, disbelieving laugh. My mother's hands fluttered nervously, but it was my father's reaction that carved the wound. He slowly placed his knife and fork down on his plate, the sound of metal on porcelain unnaturally loud. He stared at me, his face a mask of cold disapproval. "Trina," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I thought we'd been over this. The legacy of this family, this house, was built with honor. With sweat and sacrifice on the battlefield, not with ambiguous funds from some nebulous tech contract. Ambiguous funds, tech contract. He made my career, my life's work, sound like something dirty, something illicit. As if the bonuses I received for high-risk overseas deployments were no better than blood money." He wasn't finished. "We don't need your pity, and we certainly won't be using your money to keep a roof over our heads." The words hung in the air, more brutal than any physical blow. He hadn't just rejected my help. He had rejected me. He had spat on my success, delegitimized my sacrifices, and deemed my contribution worthless, all because it didn't come with a flight suit and a call sign. My mother quickly tried to change the subject, asking about the weather, but the damage was done. Something fundamental inside me had shattered. I blinked, and the face of the general in the portrait came back into focus. I was back in the corridor at Andrews, the muffled sounds of the reception filtering in. At West Point, they'd taught us about silent duty, the idea that the greatest service is often the one that goes unrecognized. For years, I had held that idea like a shield, a justification for the loneliness and the lack of understanding from my own family. but standing there with the fresh sting of my father's words and the memory of my brother's $50 insult, I realized the flaw in that logic. Silent duty was about serving your country without expecting its praise. It wasn't about letting your own family erase you. I looked down the hall at the rows upon rows of men who had fought their battles in the open. But what about a battle fought in the shadows, in the silence? What do you do when the war isn't against a foreign enemy, but against the quiet contempt of the people who are supposed to love you most? Do you surrender to their narrative, or do you find a new way to fight? The question I'd asked myself in the hallway still hung in the air, a silent challenge. Do you surrender, or do you find a new way to fight? Surrender was not in my vocabulary, it wasn't in my training, but tonight, fighting didn't mean confrontation, it meant fortification. Before I could face the main event, my brother's coronation, I needed to retreat to my own personal command center. I excused myself from the periphery of the crowd, murmuring a quiet "pardon me" as I navigated through clusters of uniformed officers. My destination wasn't the bar or an empty table. It was a small, quiet alcove near the women's restroom, a forgotten space of institutional carpeting and bland beige walls. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the building's ventilation system, a white noise that helped to drown out the distant laughter and clinking glasses. Here, in this anonymous corner, I was invisible, and for a few crucial moments, that was exactly what I needed. I pulled my secure government-issue smartphone from my clutch. The screen lit up, displaying a cascade of classified notifications and encrypted emails, the constant demanding rhythm of my real life. I ignored them all. With a practiced thumb, I swiped past the digital noise of my profession and tapped on a single, unassuming icon, a simple notes app. Pinned to the very top was a note titled Arena. The text inside was not a military directive or a coded message. It was a passage I had memorized years ago, a secular prayer that had become the cornerstone of my resilience. The words were from a speech Theodore Roosevelt gave in Paris in 1910. I had first read them as a cadet at the Air Force Academy, and they had resonated with a force that shaped the officer I would become. I read them now, my lips moving silently, the familiar cadence a balm to my raw nerves. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The faces of my family flashed in my mind, my father with his cold, dismissive eyes, my brother with his performative pity, my mother with her well-intentioned but misguided worries. They were the critics. They sat in the comfortable, well-lit stands of life, passing judgment on a game they refused to understand. They pointed out my perceived stumbles, my failure to conform to their definition of success, of womanhood, of a proper York. My eyes scanned the next lines, the words a shield forming around my heart. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. This was my truth, the arena. For me, it wasn't a battlefield of mud and steel. It was the sterile chill of a SIF, the unrelenting pressure of a digital war fought in microseconds. It was the dust of sleep deprivation after a 36-hour shift, the sweat of a high-stakes decision that could mean life or death for people I would never meet. It was the silent internal bleeding from the constant cuts of my family's disapproval. I had erred. I had come up short in their eyes again and again. But it was because I was striving. I was in the fight, while they merely watched from the sidelines. The final words of the passage settled over me, a cloak of profound, defiant peace. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement? And who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Cold and timid souls. That was it. That was them. They were safe in their world of black and white certainties, of tangible metals and visible glory. They were afraid of what they couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't boast about at a cocktail party. Their contempt for my work wasn't about me, it was about their own fear. They didn't know victory or defeat in the arena I inhabited. They only knew how to critique the warrior. A deep breath. I filled my lungs, and as I exhaled, I let go of the sting of their judgment. Their opinions were just noise. The $50 bill in my purse was just paper. The pain I felt was not a sign of my weakness, but the price of my courage. It was the cost of daring greatly. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my clutch. I stood up a little straighter, my posture shifting from that of a guest to that of a general. I smoothed down my simple dress, a silent act of rearming myself. I lifted my chin. My eyes were clear. The weary, wounded daughter had been dismissed. In her place stood Brigadier General Trina York of the United States Air Force. I was a soldier, and I was walking back into the arena. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Stepping back into the main auditorium felt different. The quiet fortitude I had summoned in the hallway settled over me, a fragile but determined peace. My mission now was simple: endure the evening, applaud when expected, and fade into the background. But as my eyes scanned the crowd, they locked onto a figure standing near the stage. A man who represented a different kind of duty, a different kind of honor. General Everett Ace Sterling. He was a living legend in the Air Force, a 4-star general who commanded the Air Force Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Agency. He was deep in conversation with a senator, but when he saw me, his expression softened. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then a subtle wave of his hand, beckoning me over. It wasn't a summons from a superior, but an invitation from a mentor, a friend. I walked towards him, my posture instinctively straightening, the years of training taking over. I felt like a young lieutenant all over again, reporting to my commanding officer. "General Sterling, Senator," I said, my voice steady. The senator smiled politely, but it was General Sterling who turned his full attention to me. He bypassed the senator and extended his hand. His handshake was firm, confident, and conveyed a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. "Trina," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the ambient noise. "I just finished the after-action report on Black Hawk this morning. Incredible work." He leaned in slightly, his eyes, which had seen the rise and fall of nations, filled with a genuine, unadulterated pride. "The Pentagon owes you a debt of gratitude, General." He called me by my rank, but his tone was personal. Then it shifted, becoming even warmer. "Are you still carrying around that worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "I've always thought Stoic philosophy was practically required reading for our line of work." For a single breathtaking moment, the weight on my shoulders lifted. He saw me. He didn't just see the uniform I didn't wear tonight, or the rank I held in secret. He saw the person underneath, the quiet intellectual, the student of philosophy, the woman who found solace in the words of a Roman emperor. He saw all of me. A wave of gratitude washed over me, so potent it almost brought tears to my eyes. This was the validation I had craved my entire life, coming not from my own blood, but from a man who commanded legions. If only they could see me like this, a voice whispered in my heart. If only they knew. The moment shattered. Trina. Jax's voice was sharp, impatient, slicing through the warm bubble of our conversation. He appeared at my side, moving with an entitled haste, not even acknowledging the senator. He draped a heavy arm over my shoulders, the gesture proprietary and dismissive. "Don't bother the general, sis," he said, his tone a patronizing mix of familiarity and command. He gave General Sterling a curt, dismissive nod, a gesture so disrespectful to a 4-star general it was almost comical. "Come on, let's go sit with the family. Mom's saving you a seat." He started to pull me away, his grip firm, as if I were a piece of luggage he was collecting. The humiliation was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't just his rudeness. It was the public declaration that my conversation, my presence with a man of such stature, was an annoyance, an insignificant diversion from my real purpose. To be a silent spectator in his family tableau. He was treating a brigadier general like a bothersome child in front of her own commanding officer. I risked a glance back. General Sterling's polite smile had vanished. His face was placid, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed, laser-focused, on my brother. It was an expression I knew well. It was the look of a commander assessing a tactical situation, identifying a point of weakness, a flaw in the system. It was cold, analytical, and utterly devoid of warmth. In that moment, he saw Jax not as a celebrated pilot, but as a problem, an obstacle. Jax, oblivious, continued to steer me toward the front rows where our family was seated. "Honestly, Trina," he muttered, loud enough for me to hear, "you can't just go up and talk to men like that. It's a bad look." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was sealed tight with a fresh layer of outrage. He was lecturing me on decorum, on appearance, completely unaware of the universe of irony he was swimming in. He led me to an empty chair between my mother and father. Mom patted my hand. "There you are, dear. We were worried." My father simply grunted, his eyes fixed on the stage, already lost in the anticipation of his son's glory. I sat down, my body rigid, the warmth from General Sterling's praise now a distant, fading memory, replaced by the familiar, bitter cold of being misunderstood. The worst part was the sharp, poignant pain of that stolen moment. For 30 seconds, I had felt like a whole person. Now I was just a sister, a daughter, a placeholder in a chair, waiting for the real show to begin. I sat rigidly in my chair, a polite, vacant smile plastered on my face, as the master of ceremonies took the stage to introduce the next speaker, my brother. The room was buzzing with anticipation. My mother, sitting beside me, nervously smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her dress, her pride almost palpable. My father sat on my other side, his posture ramrod straight, the very picture of a patriarch about to witness the validation of his legacy. I felt like a ghost at the feast, physically present, but emotionally a million miles away. The MC began to list Jax's accomplishments, a top graduate of the Air Force Academy, decorated for his service in multiple overseas deployments, a true American hero. The words faded into a dull drone as my mind, seeking refuge, pulled me back. Not far, just 1 month ago, The memory was so vivid, it felt more real than the stiff banquet chair I was sitting in. It was a Sunday evening in our family home in Alexandria. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of my mother's rosemary roasted chicken and cinnamon apple pie, a cloying aroma of forced domestic bliss, the pretense of a happy family gathering. The real reason for the dinner was the roof. The slate tiles on our ancestral home, a house that had been in the York family for generations, were failing. The repair estimate was a staggering $100,000. My father, Colonel Richard York, had announced it with the gravity of a man declaring war. My brother, Jax, ever the showman, had launched into a monologue about his portfolio, his ventures into tech startups and real estate. All high-risk, high-reward schemes that sounded more like a fantasy than a financial plan. He spoke with bravado, painting himself as a maverick entrepreneur, a pilot who conquered the markets as easily as he conquered the skies. When he finished, a heavy silence fell. Then, my father's gaze shifted to me. It was a look I knew well. It was the look of someone asking a question to which they already believed they knew the answer. "And you, Trina?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "What can you contribute?" The question was a formality, a trap. They expected me to say I could maybe help with a few thousand, that my little IT job couldn't possibly cover such a monumental expense. They expected me to be small so that Jax could appear large. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced tea. I met my father's gaze across the polished mahogany table. "I can wire the full amount tomorrow morning," I said. My voice didn't waver. It was a simple statement of fact. The reaction was immediate and profound. My mother gasped softly. Jax let out a bark of a laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He looked at me as if I'd just announced I was flying to the moon. But it was my father's reaction that stopped my heart. He didn't raise his voice. He did something far worse. He slowly, deliberately, placed his fork and knife down on his plate. The crisp clink of silver on porcelain echoing in the sudden silence. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of all warmth, as cold and hard as granite. "Trina." He said my name as if it were a foreign word he was tasting for the first time. I believed we had an understanding in this family. The York legacy, this house, was built with honor. It was paid for with the sweat of men who fought for this country, with the blood spilled on the battlefield. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a deep, unshakable disdain. It was not built with ambiguous funds from some nebulous tech contract. We do not need your pity, Trina, and we most certainly will not use your money to keep a roof over our heads. Your money. He said the words as if they were poison on his tongue. He had dismissed my entire life's work, my career, the dangerous deployments, and the immense responsibilities, as nothing more than a series of shady back-alley deals. My success wasn't something to be proud of, it was something to be suspicious of, something without honor because it wasn't earned in a cockpit. The truth my mother always quoted from the Bible, "The truth shall set you free," felt like a bitter joke. My truth was being treated like a lie. The silence that followed was broken by my mother, who quickly began talking about the church bake sale. But it was too late. The damage was done. The final fragile thread of hope that I might one day earn my father's respect had been severed. In his eyes, I would never be enough, because I was not a son and I was not a pilot. My worth and the worth of my work had been declared null and void. A sudden, deafening round of applause jolted me back to the present. On stage, Jax was smiling, waving, bathing in the adoration of the crowd. He was thanking my father for teaching him the meaning of true honor. I looked at him, then at my father, who was now beaming, his chest puffed out with pride. The scene from the dinner table replayed in my mind, a brutal, endless loop. And in that moment, sitting between the two men who defined me by my absence of what they valued, I knew the battle wasn't just about being seen. It was about surviving their definition of me. Jax's speech built to a crescendo. He spoke of legacy, of valor, of the York name. And then he delivered the final blow. It wasn't a direct attack. It was more insidious, a poisoned dart wrapped in patriotic sentiment. And finally, he said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes scanning the adoring crowd, I want to thank my family, my father, who taught me what honor truly means, my mother, whose support has been my bedrock. I want to thank the men and women who serve beside me, and all the families who understand sacrifice, the ones who are always on the front lines, whether in the sky or on the ground, the ones who truly know the price of glory, the ones who truly know. The words were a perfectly aimed weapon. With that single elegant phrase, he had surgically removed me from our family's history of service. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing himself, my father, and every pilot in the room on one side, and me, with my silent, unseen work on the other. I wasn't just the sister in the IT department anymore. I was an outsider, someone who couldn't possibly understand. I had been publicly, gracefully, and completely erased. The auditorium erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. My mother was weeping openly now, tears of pure pride streaming down her face. My father was on his feet, clapping with a stiff military rhythm, a rare, brilliant smile on his face. They rushed to the aisle to embrace Jax as he stepped down from the stage, a perfect family portrait of triumph. And I just sat there. I remained in my seat, an island of stillness in a sea of celebration. A strange calm washed over me, the raw, searing pain from my father's rejection at the dinner table, the hot shame from my brother's $50 insult. It all receded. In its place was a vast, cold emptiness. It was the feeling of a fever finally breaking after a long, delirious illness. The pain was gone, but so was the heat, the fight, the desperate hope that had kept me trying for so long. I was done trying to earn their approval, done hoping they would one day see me, done being hurt. My gaze drifted across the crowded room, past the smiling faces and the self-congratulatory backslapping, and found him, General Sterling. He was sitting in the front row, amidst the highest echelons of military and political power. He was not clapping. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute. Our eyes locked across the distance. He held my gaze for a long moment, and then he gave the slightest of nods. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a question, a silent professional inquiry from one commander to another. Is it time, General? I didn't nod back. I didn't have to. The decision had already been made, forged in the cold silence that followed my brother's final, dismissive words. My response was internal, a subtle shift in my own body. I took a deep, slow breath, held it for a count of 3, and then released it. As I exhaled, I felt my shoulders, which had been tensed for as long as I could remember, finally, completely relax. It was an act of surrender, but I wasn't surrendering to them. I was surrendering the burden, the heavy, exhausting weight of their expectations, the crushing responsibility of protecting their fragile egos with my silence. The fantasy that one day they would look at me and see a daughter, a sister, an equal. I let it all go. In that moment, a vow was formed, not in words, but in the quiet, resolute core of my being. This was no longer about revenge. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and I was done with heat. This was about correction. It was about balancing the scales. They had written their version of the story, a neat, heroic tale with me edited out. Tonight, the addendum would be read into the official record. The missing chapter was about to be declassified. And maybe you understand that feeling, that moment when you've been pushed so far that you don't break, you clarify. The point where silence is no longer a shield for your pain, but the loading of a weapon. Have you ever reached that limit? The one where you realize that allowing the truth to have its own voice isn't an act of aggression, but an act of profound self-preservation? My vow, made right then, was that I would no longer stand in the way of the truth. I was ready to let the story correct itself. The standing ovation for Jax finally began to subside, settling into a comfortable murmur of congratulations. My family was a tight, beaming knot of pride near the front of the stage, accepting handshakes and praise on Jax's behalf. I remained seated, a silent observer, feeling the cold resolution I had found in the hallway solidifying within me. The decision was made, the die was cast. Now all I could do was wait for the sequence to initiate. It began subtly. The master of ceremonies, a cheerful colonel from the public affairs office, walked back to the podium. His smile seemed a little strained now, his movements less fluid. He tapped the microphone, the sound a little too loud in the expectant room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," he said, his voice holding a new, formal tone. "We have a brief, unscheduled addition to our program this evening." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. The casual chatter died down. In a military ceremony, everything is scheduled, timed to the second. An unscheduled addition was almost unheard of. At this time, the MC continued, reading from a card that seemed to have materialized in his hand. "It is my distinct honor to introduce a special announcement from the Commander of the Air Force Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance Agency, General Everett Ace Sterling." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. It was as if a low-pressure system had suddenly rolled in. The senior officers, the colonels and generals scattered throughout the audience, sat up straighter, their relaxed postures instantly replaced by parade ground correctness. My family, who had been basking in Jax's glow, paused mid-laugh. My father's smile faltered, replaced by a deep, questioning frown. He knew, as every officer in the room knew, that a 4-star ISR commander doesn't make unscheduled announcements at an awards dinner, unless it is a matter of grave importance. General Sterling moved toward the stage with an unhurried, deliberate grace that commanded attention. He didn't smile. His face was a mask of sober professionalism. He ascended the steps, shook the MC's hand, and stood at the podium. He adjusted the microphone, the small movement seeming to take an eternity. "Thank you, Colonel," he began, his voice calm and resonant, easily filling the now silent auditorium. "Tonight we have rightly honored a hero, a pilot who exemplifies the courage and skill of our Air Force." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing briefly on Jax. "But there are other kinds of heroes in our military, heroes whose stories are not written in headlines, but in classified code, whose victories are not measured in territory gained, but in disasters averted. They are the guardians who watch over us from the shadows." My heart began to pound. a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. This was it. A flicker of panic, of a lifelong instinct for secrecy, flared within me. For a moment, I wanted to stand up and shout, "Stop!" But then I thought of my team. The brilliant, sleepless analysts, the tireless coders, the ghosts in the machine, who, like me, lived in a world of silent sacrifice. This wasn't just for me, it was for them. As if on cue, a young captain in a pristine service dress uniform walked onto the stage. He carried a single, slim manila folder. But this was no ordinary folder. It was bound with red tape, and stamped across the front in bold, stark letters was the classification, top secret. As the captain placed it on the podium, I could see a second stamp, freshly inked in a bold diagonal slash across the first, declassified. And beneath it, in smaller, authoritative type, by order of the President of the United States. A collective, barely audible gasp went through the audience. General Sterling placed a hand on the folder, but didn't open it yet. He let the tension build, a master of psychological timing. "Today," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing every ear in the room closer, "the President has authorized the declassification of one of the most critical and successful intelligence operations in the history of modern warfare, Operation Black Hawk." He opened the folder. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. I watched my family. My mother looked utterly bewildered, her hand clutching my father's arm. My father was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in intense concentration, trying to connect the dots. And Jax had a smirk on his face. A faint, arrogant curve of his lips. He thought this was some kind of preamble, some grand abstract speech about the nature of warfare before they got back to celebrating him. He had no idea. He didn't know that the storm, which had been gathering on a distant horizon for years, was not about to break. It had just made landfall, directly in his living room. General Sterling's voice resonated with historical gravity. He wasn't just giving a speech, he was testifying before history. He spoke of Operation Black Hawk, not in vague terms, but with chilling precision. He described a global terrorist network poised to unleash chaos, a plot so sophisticated it had eluded every other intelligence agency. Behind him, the large screen flickered to life. It didn't show faces. It showed something far more terrifying to those in the know. Cascading lines of malicious code, satellite maps with converging attack vectors, and intercepted communications that spoke of imminent catastrophic success. This network, the general stated, his voice like steel, was not defeated by bombs or bullets. It was dismantled from the inside out. In a silent, digital war fought across 3 continents. A single commanding officer, operating under extreme pressure and with incomplete intelligence, made a series of high-risk decisions that went against established protocols. My breath caught in my throat. I could see the operation unfolding again in my mind's eye. The 3 a.m. calls, the gut-wrenching choices, the moment I overrode a direct recommendation from a senior analyst, trusting my own instinct. That officer's final, decisive command, Sterling continued, his gaze sweeping the room, not only neutralized the entire network without a single American casualty, but also led to the recovery of assets that prevented the downing of a military transport plane. It saved the lives of hundreds of American service members. The screen behind him changed. It now showed a single, stark image, the elegant silver and blue design of the Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Air Force. A murmur went through the room, a sound of awe and disbelief. The Air Force Cross was a legend, a medal for heroism, so profound it bordered on the mythical. It was a pilot's medal, a warrior's medal. It was not a medal for someone who worked with computers. The world seemed to slow down. I could feel the collective gaze of the room beginning to shift. 1,000 points of curiosity, trying to find the subject of this incredible story. "The commander of Operation Black Hawk," General Sterling announced, his voice reaching its peak. "The youngest woman in the history of the United States Air Force to be promoted to the rank of Brigadier General in Air Force Intelligence is in this room with us tonight." He paused. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum, pulling every ounce of air and sound from the vast auditorium. I watched my family. My mother's confusion had turned to a dawning, horrified understanding. My father's face was a rigid mask of disbelief, his mind, I knew, furiously trying and failing to process the words he was hearing. And Jack's, the arrogant smirk had long since vanished. His face was ashen, his jaw slack. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. General Sterling turned his body slightly, his gaze locking directly onto our table, onto me. "It is my profound honor," he declared, his voice booming with the weight of his office, "to invite to the stage Brigadier General Trina York." The name hit the room like a sonic boom. For a split second, there was nothing, just stunned, absolute silence. Then it began, not from my family, but from the front rows. A senator was the first to rise, then another general, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause didn't just start, it exploded. It was a roar, a tidal wave of sound and respect that crashed over me, so powerful it felt like a physical force. I pushed my chair back and stood. My legs felt strangely steady. I walked the long path to the stage, each step measured and sure. I was no longer Trina, the awkward sister. I was General York, and I was answering a summons. On stage, General Sterling's face was etched with profound respect. The young captain who had brought the dossier now presented a velvet box. Sterling opened it, lifted the Air Force Cross, and with practiced, reverent hands, pinned it to my simple navy dress. The weight of the medal was real, solid, a tangible counterpoint to a lifetime of being made to feel insubstantial. He stepped back, raised his hand to his brow, and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. I returned it, my own movements precise and automatic. He gestured to the podium. It was my turn. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, the blur of uniforms and evening gowns, all turned toward me. For the first time in my life, I did not flinch from their gaze. I did not search for my family in the crowd. I didn't need to. My speech was not for them. "Thank you, General Sterling," I began, my voice clear and amplified, carrying to every corner of the room. "This honor does not belong to me alone." I paused, letting the silence settle again. "It belongs to the unseen, to the analysts who give up their nights, the coders who chase ghosts through networks, the linguists who find meaning in whispers. It belongs to the quiet professionals, the ghosts in the machine, who stand a silent watch so that others may live in the light." I looked directly at the crowd, my gaze sweeping over them all, equals in this moment. "On behalf of all of them, I thank you." That was all. I stepped back from the podium, short, professional, to the point. Not a single word about family, sacrifice, or personal struggle. My silence, the one they had always taken for weakness, had just delivered the final devastating blow. I had not just told my story, I had claimed my place in a larger one. a narrative so far beyond their comprehension that it rendered their small, petty judgments utterly meaningless. The applause that followed was even louder than the first. It was a sound of deep, resounding respect. And as I stood there, under the bright stage lights, I finally felt the chill of the last 39 years begin to thaw. The applause from the main hall faded to a distant roar as I followed an aide down a quiet, carpeted hallway. The public part of the evening was over. The private reckoning was about to begin. The aide led me to a small private lounge, a VIP waiting room, I presumed. It was tastefully decorated with leather armchairs and prints of historic aircraft. I knew, without being told, that General Sterling had arranged this. He had anticipated the fallout and provided a secure, neutral ground for it to happen. A true strategist, he thought 3 moves ahead, even in social situations. I didn't have to wait long. The door opened and they entered. My family, my mother, Eleanor, her face tear-streaked and bewildered. My father, Richard, his military bearing crumbling, replaced by a deep, wounded confusion. And Jax, my brother's face was a mask of raw, bruised ego, his complexion a mottled red of shame and fury. The door clicked shut, sealing the 4 of us in a sudden, suffocating silence. It was Jax who broke it, his voice explosive in the small space. "Why?" he snarled, taking a step toward me. "Why would you do that, Trina? You made me look like a complete fool in front of everyone. My squadron, my commanding officers, everyone." His anger, so predictable, so self-centered, didn't even register as a sting. It was just noise. Before I could answer, my father spoke, his voice trembling with a hurt that was, for the first time, genuine. "Trina, honey, why didn't you ever tell us? A general, the Air Force Cross. Why would you keep that from your mother and me?" I looked at them, truly looked at them, and a profound sadness washed over me. Even now, after everything, their first questions were about themselves. How it made him look, why they weren't told. My moment of recognition was still just a reflection in the mirror of their own feelings. The exhaustion I felt was immense, a bone-deep weariness from a lifetime of this. But with the exhaustion came clarity. "I didn't tell you," I began, my voice calm and measured, the voice of a briefer, not a daughter, "because I took an oath of secrecy, an oath that both of you, as military men, are supposed to understand better than anyone." I held my father's gaze. "It's the same reason you never discussed the details of your reconnaissance missions over Vietnam, Dad." I let that sink in before continuing. "And I didn't tell you because on the rare occasions I tried to share even the smallest unclassified part of my world, I was met with dismissal and contempt." I turned my full attention to Jax. His face was still a thundercloud of indignation. "You don't look like a fool because of me, Jax," I said, my voice devoid of heat. A simple statement of fact. "You look like a fool because of your own arrogance. Because for 20 years you never once in your asked a single, serious question about my life. You just assumed you knew. You created a caricature of me in your head, the boring, underpaid IT sister, and you treated me accordingly." His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time he seemed to be at a loss for words. Then I faced my father. This was the hardest part. The anger was gone, and what remained was a vast, hollow ache. "And you, Dad," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "You taught me about honor, but you only recognize the kind of honor you can see, the kind you can polish and hang on a wall. I tried to help this family. I tried to give you the most honorable thing I could offer, my support, earned through my service. and you threw it back in my face. You called it ambiguous funds. You implied it was dirty. I took a deep breath, the air in the room feeling thick and heavy. I have spent my entire life trying to earn your respect. I see now that it was an impossible mission. You don't respect what you don't understand. I looked from my father's shocked face to my brother's stunned silence, to my mother's silent tears. I no longer need your permission to be proud of who I am or what I do, I said, and the words felt like liberation. But from this day forward, I require your respect. It's not a request. It is a non-negotiable term of engagement. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not empty. It was filled with the wreckage of a lifetime of assumptions. The foundation of our family dynamic had been pulverized, and none of them knew how to stand on the new, uncertain ground. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. The briefing was over. I turned, walked to the door, and let myself out, leaving them behind in the quiet, suffocating fallout of the truth. As the door clicked shut behind me, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I just felt quiet. The quiet of a battlefield after the battle is over, when the only thing left to do is survey the damage and begin the long walk home. 6 months passed. The chill of that night at the awards ceremony slowly thawed, replaced by the warm, golden hues of a Virginian autumn. The maple trees lining the streets of Old Town Alexandria were ablaze in brilliant shades of yellow and crimson. For the first time since the ceremony, I was back at my parents' house, not for a confrontation, but for a quiet Saturday afternoon. The first thing I noticed upon entering the living room was the mantelpiece. The heavy marble slab above the fireplace had always served as the York family's shrine to its own legacy. For as long as I could remember, it had been dominated by 2 photographs. A handsome, black and white portrait of my father, a young colonel in front of his F-15, and a dynamic color shot of Jax, grinning confidently beside his F-22 Raptor. They were icons of a specific kind of glory. But now there was a third. It was my official portrait. Brigadier General Trina York, in my formal service dress uniform, the silver star gleaming on my shoulder. The Air Force Cross was pinned neatly on my chest, its blue ribbon a stark contrast to the dark uniform. The frame was identical to the other 2. My picture wasn't placed off to the side, nor was it smaller or larger. It stood in the center, in a position of equal prominence. We were 3, not 2, a trinity of service. As I was taking it in, my father walked into the room. He saw me looking at the mantel. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over, his steps slower than I remembered, and stood beside me. He reached out a hand, his fingers, gnarled from years of gripping a control stick, gently brushing against the glass of my picture frame. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch, a silent acknowledgement, an apology, a peace offering. He cleared his throat, still not looking at me. "Your mother wants to know if you want your burger medium or medium well," he said gruffly. "Medium is fine, Dad," I replied, my voice softer than I expected. He simply nodded and walked out toward the backyard, but the weight of his small gesture remained. It was more eloquent than any speech he could have given. The air in the backyard was filled with the familiar, comforting smell of grilling burgers and freshly cut grass. My mother was fussing over a bowl of potato salad, and for the first time, her fussing didn't feel like a judgment, just motherly. The tension that had been a permanent resident in our family gatherings was gone. In its place was a quiet, slightly awkward effort. It wasn't perfect, It was real. I was sitting on the patio steps when Jax came over. He was holding 2 cold bottles of Sam Adams Boston Lager, condensation beating on the dark brown glass. He handed one to me without a word. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the smoke curl up from the grill. I read some of the declassified articles about Operation Black Hawk, he said finally, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the bottle in his hands. He wouldn't look at me. It was unbelievable, Trina, what you did. He took a long swallow of his beer. I waited, knowing there was more. He turned to me then, and for the first time I saw not the arrogant fighter pilot, but just my little brother. His eyes were filled with a shame that was real and deep. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely a whisper. "For everything. For the $50. For all of it. I was a jerk. A jealous, arrogant jerk." 2 words. I had waited a lifetime to hear them, and now that they were here, they didn't bring a sense of victory. They brought a sense of peace, a quiet closing of a wound. I managed a small smile. "I know," I said. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 6 months. He raised his bottle. "To you," he said. I raised mine to meet it, the clink of glass a small, clear note in the autumn air. "To us," I corrected gently. He smiled, a real smile this time. "Welcome home, General." "Welcome home, Major," I replied. We sat there sipping our beers as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The scars were still there, I knew. They always would be. They were part of the map of who we were. But they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of a battle fought, and, in its own way, won. We were a family learning to speak a new language, one not based on assumptions or expectations, but on the quiet, steady grammar of respect. My legacy, I realized, wasn't the medal on my uniform or the photo on the mantle. It was this fragile, hard-won peace, the breaking of a cycle. And it was more than enough. My story found its peace, not in a grand victory, but in a quiet conversation over a backyard grill. It was a peace built on the new language of respect. And perhaps my story reminds you of your own. Maybe you've also felt invisible, or had your worth dismissed by the very people who should have seen you most clearly. If you have a story like mine, one of silent struggle and hard-won strength, I hope you'll share it in the comments below. Your voice matters, and if stories like this resonate with you, please subscribe to Chosen Revenge for more true stories about finding your power.